the end of the day, allies depend on the United States a lot more than vice versa, so the United States can structure the terms of these alliance agreements to privilege its own interests.
Hello, I'm Sean Lynn-Jones. I'm the editor of International Security, a quarterly journal that's edited at the Belfer Center here at Harvard's Kennedy School. Today, I'm speaking to Michael Beckley. Mike is the author of an article called The Myth of Entangling Alliances, Reassessing the Risks of U.S. Defense Pacts. It's a fascinating conclusion that the United States actually doesn't get dragged into war by so-called entangling alliances. How do you reach that conclusion? What's the evidence to support this argument?
So I analyzed every U.S. military conflict since 1948, which is the year that the United States signed its first standing alliance. There's 188 conflicts in total, and I asked a basic question: to what extent was U.S. involvement in these conflicts driven by some type of alliance, formal alliance obligation?
When you looked at all of these cases, why doesn't the United States find itself being drawn into war by its alliance commitments?
I think there's several explanations that you see consistent evidence for. One is that these alliance treaties, first of all, are pretty vague. They don't say that the United States has to come in guns blazing and defend its allies to the death. They say things like act together to meet the common danger in line with your constitutional process. So there's some wiggle room there, and the United States, because it's so much more powerful than any of its allies, can kind of dictate what that actually means. So I think a lot of this has to do with the asymmetry in power. At the end of the day, allies depend on the United States a lot more than vice versa, so the United States can structure the terms of these alliance agreements to privilege its own interests.
Now, do allies actually restrain the United States from potentially unnecessary wars in some cases?
They have on some occasions. They've tried to in a lot of occasions, in fact. What I found is, the United States has this huge alliance network, 68 different countries. They're all over in different regions. And what often happens is in any given conflict, only a few allies actually want the United States to intervene. They're directly threatened by the conflict. The rest of the allies who are in other regions actually want the United States to stay out because they don't want the U.S. to drain its resources in some faraway conflict or escalate that conflict into a global war that could include them. British leaders call this annihilation without representation. So to avoid that, they actually lobby the United States and say, stay out of this conflict.
One of the alliances that has raised a lot of concern lately is part of the NATO alliance. And it's the alliance of the United States with the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Now, these countries obviously have a number of disputes with Russia, and Russia has shown a propensity to act assertively, maybe even aggressively, in Ukraine, where the United States does not have an alliance. What do you think the risk is of the United States being drawn into an overt conflict with Russia because of these NATO alliances with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia?
I do think the risk is definitely higher there than for the vast majority of other U.S. alliances. I think the most risky alliances in general are those where the states in question are strong enough to get into trouble, to start a fight, but they're too weak to finish the fight by themselves. So it would be dependent on the U.S. and the country they're picking a fight with cares a lot more about the issues at stake than the United States does. That's a very scary recipe, and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are a major concern, rightly so.
Are there any other countries that are U.S. allies that might be in a high risk, or at least a riskier category, along with the Baltic states?
I think in Asia, Taiwan and the Philippines are the ones that scare me the most, because again, you have that bad witch's brew of, they're strong enough to get into trouble, probably not. They're a lot weaker than China, they have major disputes with, and China cares a lot more, especially in the case of Taiwan, about the issues at stake.
So what should we do? Are there any alliances that need to be reconsidered? And what overall course should the United States chart?
My main advice for policy would be to focus on domestic reforms that we can make. I mean, we can modulate the alliance portfolio, but I think change at the core has to come from within. And so what I would like to see is stronger institutional constraints on the president's ability to send U.S. forces into battle. Historically, the Congress is supposed to declare war, and the president and the Congress are supposed to work that out, but over the last few decades, presidents have been able to get around that by just not calling major military interventions wars.
So you're saying, in a nutshell, we don't need to fundamentally reconsider U.S. engagement in the world, but your research suggests some modifications and some precautions that we could take to ensure that the United States doesn't get entangled in any unnecessary wars.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think I'm not ruling out changes to the alliance network or forward deployed troops. There could be good reasons to do all those things. But in general, I think the major restraint for the United States has to come domestically.
Well, thank you very much for being with us here today, Mike. The article is called The Myth of Entangling Alliances, Reassessing the Security Risks of U.S. Defense Pacts. Thank you again for being with us today, Mike.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.